The rain was relentless, pouring down in sheets that turned the dirt road into a river of mud. Thunder rolled across the hills like cannon fire, and in the middle of that storm a scream cut through the night. A child's scream, sharp, terrified, unforgettable. At that very moment, Daniel Cole, a struggling single father whose hands had once built furniture that graced the finest homes, dropped his rusted toolbox. The sound of it hitting the ground was drowned by the storm, but Daniel didn't notice. His boots splashed through puddles as he ran heart-pounding toward the source of that cry. This is where our story begins, with a man who had already lost almost everything a girl pinned beneath a fallen oak, and a mother who would soon collide with the past she never wanted to face. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has gone. Daniel was already soaked when he reached the tree line at the edge of the trailer park. The storm had been building all afternoon, rattling loose shingles and bending power lines, but no one expected the century-old oak to split the way it did. A massive branch had crashed down across the narrow road, crushing everything beneath it. And beneath it, trapped and sobbing, was a girl no older than 8. Her bike, a sleek model with chrome handlebars and a paint job far too expensive for this neighborhood, lay twisted and broken in the mud. The bright yellow helmet had saved her skull from splitting on the asphalt, but her small leg was pinned at an unnatural angle under the branch. Mud streaked her designer jacket and tears mingled with rain on her cheeks. Daniel dropped to his knees. His breath came fast, not from the run, but from the sudden fear clawing at his chest. He had seen injuries before he had watched his late wife waste away in hospital rooms, where machines hummed and doctors whispered, but there was something about a child in pain that made his throat close. "Sweetheart," he said softly, leaning close so his voice could reach through the storm. "Don't move. My name's Daniel. I'm going to help you, all right?" The girl looked up at him with wide, panicked eyes. "It hurt," she sobbed. "I can't move my leg." Daniel pressed his palm to the branch. It was heavy, swollen with water, but his body knew leverage. His hands, rough with calluses, had once carved wood into cradles and tables. Now they tightened on bark as he braced his boots in the mud. "Stay still," he whispered again, and he heaved. The branch shifted with a groan heavy as regret. His back screamed. His shoulders shook, but he did not stop until he had lifted enough to slide her leg free. The girl gasped, her cry sharp and piercing, but her body loosened as the crushing weight vanished. Daniel dropped the branch and knelt beside her, cradling her injured ankle with careful hands. Already swelling, already bent wrong. A break for certain. "We'll get you to a hospital," Daniel murmured. "You're safe now." Her small fingers clutched his sleeve, clinging with the desperate trust only children could give to strangers. "My mom," she whispered through tears. "She's going to be so mad." Daniel shook his head. "No, sweetheart. She'll just be glad you're alive." He lifted her into his arms. She was light, fragile, trembling from the cold and the shock. Her wet hair stuck to his cheek as she buried her face against him. The storm beat against his back, but he shielded her as best he could, his boots carrying them toward his old pickup, parked by the trailer park's edge. Inside his trailer, his son, Ethan, was waiting. 7-year-old asthmatic sitting by the window with the puzzle box Daniel had built to distract him. Daniel had promised he'd be back soon after fixing Mrs. Peterson's fence. He'd promised. But promises had become fragile things in his world, broken too often by bills, by sickness, by storms like this. Dad, Ethan had whispered when Daniel left earlier. "Don't be long." Now Ethan was alone, wheezing in the dark, while Daniel carried another man's daughter in his arms. The truck coughed twice before starting, the engine sputtering like it had been resurrected by stubbornness alone. Daniel settled the girl on the bench seat, propping her injured leg carefully. She tried to be brave, biting her lip so she wouldn't cry again. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Are you going to call my mom as soon as we get to the hospital?" Daniel said. "She'll want to know you're safe." Her eyes dropped. Rain tapped the windshield like impatient fingers as Daniel drove toward Millbrook General, each mile a battle between speed and caution. The storm blurred the world into streaks of gray. His wipers struggled to keep up. At the hospital, the emergency room lights glared bright against the night. Daniel carried the girl inside. Nurses swarmed, their voices brisk and professional. Forms appeared on clipboards. Insurance questions, parental consent, emergency contacts, all words Daniel couldn't answer. "Who are you to her?" one nurse asked sharply. "I found her." Daniel said simply. She needed help. The girl clutched his hand even as they wheeled her away. Stay with me, she begged. Daniel nodded, though he knew his son was alone in the trailer waiting. Still, he sat beside the gurney. Still, he stayed. Minutes blurred into an hour. The storm outside pounded against glass, but inside Daniel's stillness anchored the frightened child. He whispered reassurances he didn't fully believe. He squeezed her hand when she whimpered. Then came the sound of heels, sharp, quick, authoritative. The emergency room parted for a woman who entered like she owned it. Dark hair pulled back with precision, a tailored black suit unmarked by rain, eyes that cut like glass. Where is she, the woman demanded. Where's my daughter? Daniel turned and for the first time saw Isabella Grant, the billionaire mother, whose world would soon crash into his. The sterile light of the hospital seemed to dim as Isabella Grant entered her presence, commanding in a way that silenced even the bustling nurses. She moved with purpose, heels striking the linoleum like a metronome of authority. Her eyes, sharp and searching, landed on the small figure lying on the gurney. Relief flashed across her features for just an instant before a mother's panic took over. "Oh, Sophie," Isabella whispered, kneeling by her daughter's side. Her manicured hands trembled as they brushed wet strands of hair from the girl's face. "Sweetheart, are you all right? Where does it hurt?" Sophie clung to Daniel's hand, refusing to let go even as her mother's perfume filled the sterile room. The child's lips trembled, her voice a weak whisper. "Mom, this is Daniel. He saved me." The words hung in the air, strange and heavy, connecting two worlds that had never meant to touch. Isabella's gaze shifted for the first time, truly taking in the man standing at her daughter's side. Daniel Cole looked every inch the outsider here. His flannel shirt clung damp to his shoulders, his jeans were caked with mud, his boots still left wet tracks across the tile. His hands, calloused, scarred, bearing the proof of years of labor, rested gently over Sophie's smaller ones. Something flickered in Isabella's eyes. Gratitude, yes, but also calculation. This stranger, unshaven and weary, didn't belong in her world of power lunches and board meetings. And yet here he stood, the person her daughter clung to with absolute trust. "Thank you." Isabella said, her tone softer now, though still lined with the reserve of a woman who had learned long ago not to show weakness. "Thank you for helping her." Daniel nodded once, uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze. Any man would have done the same, but he knew that wasn't true. Too many people had learned to look away when someone else was in trouble. He had seen it at the workshop when creditors came knocking. He had seen it in the neighbor's eyes when the foreclosure notice went up on his house. And yet, when Sophie screamed, he hadn't hesitated. The nurse returned brisk and efficient. "We'll need to do x-rays. She's likely fractured her ankle. Surgery might be required." Isabella's lips tightened, her perfectly lined eyes shifting to the doctor, already preparing. "Whatever it takes, spare no expense." Her voice carried authority that bent rules without effort. Insurance paperwork, consent forms. All of it dissolved under her command. Daniel stood back, an outsider once again, as if the invisible line of class and money had been redrawn in front of him. Still, Sophie held on. "Stay with me, Daniel, please." And so he stayed. He sank into the plastic chair beside her, the sound of rain hammering on windows, muffled by the hum of machines. His son Ethan flashed through his mind, alone in the trailer, wheezing, counting on the sound of his father's return. Daniel's chest ached with guilt, but Sophie's fingers clung to his like an anchor. Isabella noticed. Her brow furrowed as she studied the way her daughter's trembling eased whenever Daniel spoke, the way she ignored everyone else to focus on him. Isabella prided herself on being Sophie's rock, yet here was a stranger with muddy boots providing comfort she couldn't. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The minutes stretched long. Nurses moved in and out, preparing Sophie for x-rays. Daniel's mind drifted. He thought of Ethan's medicine, the inhaler nearly empty. He thought of the eviction notice tucked behind unpaid utility bills. He thought of the cemetery's cruel letter threatening to move Sarah's grave, his late wife, the woman whose laughter had once filled their home with light. The ache of that loss returned like the storm outside, loud, relentless, impossible to escape. He shifted in his seat, his eyes lowering to his hands. Hands that had once built heirloom tables, carved chairs, crafted cradles for new parents. Hands now relegated to patching fences for $25 at a time. Dad always says his hands can make anything, Ethan had once told a neighbor proudly. He can make furniture sing. But those same hands could not stop hospital bills from piling, could not hold on to their house, could not stop the cancer that devoured Sarah piece by piece. Mr. Cole. Isabella's voice startled him from his thoughts. He looked up to find her standing across from him, her gaze steady, appraising. You've been here this whole time. I can take it from here now. Daniel's jaw tightened. He should leave. Ethan needed him, but when he glanced down, Sophie's grip only tightened. Her lips quivered. Don't go. Isabella exhaled softly, caught between gratitude and confusion. Her daughter, normally shy with strangers, was clinging to this man as if he were family. The sight both warmed and stung her. I'll stay until she's asleep, Daniel said quietly. A silence settled heavy with unspoken truths. Isabella nodded once as if granting permission she had no authority over. Very well. The doctor returned with news the ankle was fractured, surgery was required, but the prognosis was good. Isabella's relief was palpable. She bent to kiss Sophie's forehead, whispering promises of healing and comfort. Yet when Sophie's eyes fluttered with exhaustion, it was Daniel's hand she held. Later, as Sophie was wheeled to X-ray, Daniel found himself alone with Isabella in the waiting room. The storm outside lashed against glass, the sound of rain drumming like restless fingers. Where do you live? Mr. Cole. Isabella's tone was polite, but edged with curiosity. Daniel hesitated. He could see the polished leather of her shoes, the shimmer of diamonds on her wrist. She didn't belong in his world, and he didn't belong in hers, but lying felt pointless. Riverside Mobile Park, Trailer 37. Her eyes flickered with recognition. She knew that place. She'd driven past the sagging trailers on her way to her estate. She'd taught herself not to look too closely, as though poverty might cling if she stared too long. I see, she murmured. Her voice was careful, but Daniel had heard that tone before from doctors, from teachers, from parents of Ethan's classmates. It was the sound of velvet-covered judgment. He looked away, pride burning in his chest. He wanted to leave, to retreat back to the shadows where no one could measure him against their wealth. But Sophie's voice echoed in his mind. Stay with me, Daniel. And so he stayed silent in the sterile room, while across from him sat the woman who would unknowingly hold the key to everything he had lost. The storm outside had not relented. Rain streamed down the tall windows of Millbrook General, streaks of water running like veins across the glass. The world beyond blurred into shadows and distant headlights, while inside fluorescent light buzzed overhead, indifferent to the lives unraveling beneath it. Daniel sat slouched in the plastic chair, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The gurney where Sophie lay had been wheeled away for X-rays, leaving behind a strange emptiness he hadn't expected to feel. His hands rested on his knees, calloused fingers twitching restlessly as he thought of his son. Ethan was alone. Alone in their cramped trailer, alone with the thin walls that did nothing to keep out the draft, alone with his shallow breaths that sometimes caught in his chest like a lock clicking shut. Daniel's promise to return quickly had been broken yet again. Guilt gnawed at him sharper with every minute that passed. Is she going to be okay? The voice startled him. Isabella stood near the window, her arms folded across her tailored blazer. The glass reflected her face, controlled, elegant, but shadowed with a mother's worry. She'll heal, Daniel replied after a pause. Kids are stronger than we give them credit for. The doctors know what they're doing. The words sounded steady, but Daniel knew the truth. He was repeating lines he had once told himself at hospital bedsides, long nights when Sarah's pulse monitors beeped steadily, deceptively, until they didn't. He forced the memory back down. Isabella turned, studying him with a gaze that could strip paint. She trusts you. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. She was scared. I happened to be there. Any decent person would have stopped. You underestimate what most people are willing to do, Isabella said softly. Her tone carried no accusation, only weary knowledge. Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer before she sat across the small table, her posture perfect even in exhaustion. The silence stretched. It was not companionable nor openly hostile, but thick with the distance of two people pulled from opposite worlds and thrown into the same orbit by accident. Daniel broke it first. "My son's at home. Ethan. He's 7. He surprised himself by mentioning it. Perhaps he felt the need to explain the constant worry etched across his face. "He has asthma. Some days are harder than others." Isabella tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "And you left him alone tonight?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't have a choice." Her eyes flickered with something he recognized instantly. Judgment wrapped in politeness. He'd seen that look at school orientations from administrators who noted his address on enrollment forms. He bristled, but said nothing more. Moments later, the doors slid open and the gurney returned. Sophie's face was pale, but her eyes lit the moment they found Daniel. "You stayed," she whispered, relief spilling across her features. Daniel nodded, pushing down the guilt that pressed heavier with every glance at the clock. "I told you I would." Isabella moved quickly to her daughter's side, her hands brushing over Sophie's hair and cheek, her voice gentle. Yet Sophie reached again for Daniel's hand, the small fingers wrapping around his with instinctive trust. The doctor arrived, explaining in clinical tones that surgery would be scheduled for the following morning. The fracture was serious, but recovery was expected. Isabella's questions came rapid-fire, efficient, informed. She was used to making decisions to ensuring control. Yet Daniel noticed her daughter's eyes never left him, as though he were the tether holding her together in the storm. When at last Sophie drifted into a medicated sleep, the hospital quieted around them. Isabella straightened her composure, flawless once again. "You should go home to your son," she said firmly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of gratitude. Daniel nodded, rising slowly. His back ached from lifting the branch. His clothes were still damp, his muscles sore. He hesitated only a moment, looking at the girl whose small hand still twitched as though searching for his. Then he forced himself toward the exit. Outside, the storm lashed at him again, cold and merciless. His truck stood like a weary soldier in the parking lot, its paint chipped its tires, caked with mud. He climbed inside and started the engine, the sound a comforting rumble against the rain. The drive back to Riverside Mobile Park was long and treacherous. The wipers smeared more than they cleared, and Daniel squinted through the downpour, his thoughts a jumble of worry. By the time he pulled into the gravel drive, the storm had become a steady roar. The trailer loomed in the dark, its single light burning weakly in the window. Daniel's chest tightened. He pushed open the door, and there was Ethan sitting at the small kitchen table, puzzle box pieces scattered before him, inhaler clenched in one small fist. "Dad?" Ethan said, his voice rough but steady. "You came back." Daniel's throat ached as he knelt beside him. "Of course I did, buddy. I'm sorry it took so long." Ethan studied him with eyes too old for his years. "You smell like rain. And something else. Like the hospital." Daniel hesitated, then said, "There was a little girl. She got hurt in the storm. I couldn't leave her there." Ethan nodded slowly. "Did you fix her like you fix everything else?" The question cut deep. Daniel wanted to say yes, wanted to promise that everything he touched could be mended, but he had lived long enough to know that wasn't true. Still, he smiled faintly. "I tried." Ethan placed a puzzle piece into the box, the click of wood against wood, echoing in the silence. His small fingers traced the dovetail joints his father had carved. Mom used to say your hands could make anything, even hope. Daniel swallowed hard, staring at those puzzle pieces, each one fitting into another with quiet inevitability. He thought of Sophie's small hand gripping his, of Isabella's unreadable gaze, of the storm that had brought their worlds colliding together. And though exhaustion threatened to pull him under, a strange sense of unease lingered. Something told him this was only the beginning, that the cry he had heard in the storm would echo far longer than the rain outside his window. Morning came dulled and gray, like the sky itself was tired from the night's violence. In the recovery wing, Sophie dozed beneath a warmed blanket, her leg immobilized in a pale cast, the faint scent of antiseptic hanging like a thin veil over everything. The surgery had been clean and quick, a standard reset with bright instruments and steady hands. When she woke, the first word out of her mouth wasn't Mom. It was Daniel. Isabella was there before the word fully left her daughter's lips. She brushed hair from Sophie's forehead, willing a smile to steady. He had to check on his son baby. He'll visit. Sophie's brow pinched a small crease of stubbornness that Isabella recognized as her own. I want to see Ethan too. We'll see. Isabella kissed her cheek, her chest tightening at the warm skin under her lips. First we follow doctor's orders. But through the day, as kind nurses fluffed pillows and checked vitals, Sophie returned to the same thought with childlike gravity. She asked about wood and puzzles. She asked if Daniel's truck could make it in the rain again. She asked if Ethan's breathing was better today than yesterday. Isabella answered gently, each reply chipping away at the careful distance she kept between strangers and their need. This wasn't a stranger in Sophie's mind. This was someone who had shown up when it counted. By afternoon, the anesthetic fog cleared and the stubborn line in Sophie's mouth deepened. Please, Mom, I need to thank him right. Not here where everything is beeping. I want to see where he lives. Isabella hesitated, recognizing the two roads ahead, the efficient answer and the right one. Efficiency said there was no reason to enter that other world. The right answer sounded like a door unlocking in her own chest, a quiet, inconvenient courage. She took a breath. Fine, she said softly. A short visit. Crutches only from bed to chair. We don't risk that leg. Sophie's smile bloomed like a lamp turned on in a dark room. Thank you. The Mercedes purred through damp streets, fat droplets still clinging to the windshield in stubborn pearls. Riverside Mobile Park hunched under low clouds, aluminum siding gleaming dully porches cluttered with small attempts at beauty wind chimes, potted geraniums, a flag bleached by seasons. People looked up when the sedan rolled past, heads bent together, curtain corners lifted. As they idled in front of Trailer 37, Isabella felt eyes on the back of her neck, the same prickling she felt in boardrooms just before a vote turned. The trailer itself was neat in the way necessity teaches neatness. A swept stoop, a patched screen door, a little wooden horse perched on the rail, its legs slender, its mane carved in delicate curls, as if the wood had grown that way and was merely revealed. Isabella's breath stilled on the sight. Intricate, confident, no wasted line. Whoever had made it understood restraint as deeply as flourish. The door opened before she knocked. Daniel stepped into the rectangle of light, one hand braced on the jamb, the other hovering near his hip as if he wasn't sure what to do with it. He looked better in daylight, still tired, still rumpled, but steadier somehow, with morning in his eyes. Behind him a small shape lurked at knee height, more shadow than boy. Hi, Sophie said before anyone else could speak, her voice brightening the damp air. She'd insisted on the crutches, insisted on doing the 3 careful steps from car to stoop herself. I came to show you I'm okay. Sort of. Look. She tapped the cast lightly with the end of a crutch, then winced at her own enthusiasm. Daniel's mouth tilted. Looks like you won. Against the tree, Sophie nodded gravely. Totally. His gaze shifted to Isabella, a question there that she chose to answer with candor. She wouldn't rest until we came, she said, and I wanted to thank you properly. She swallowed the extra words, the ones that would have made the thanks too heavy. May we? Daniel stepped back. The boy's shadow darted behind him, then peeked out again, a solemn pair of eyes over the edge of a worn t-shirt. This is Ethan, Daniel said. His voice softened in the saying. Buddy, this is Sophie. She's the one I told you about. Sophie lifted a hand in greeting, wobbling on the crutches, then glanced past Ethan. The small living room revealed itself in careful layers, a table whose surface gleamed like honey, hand-cut dovetails at the corners. 2 chairs each with a subtle curve at the back that invited the body to relax. Shelves made of simple pine transformed by attention filled with library paperbacks and neat rows of labeled jars. A narrow bunk bed tucked into an alcove, edges rounded smooth by a sander safety rails fitted tight. Every inch of the space had been bent toward usefulness. Every compromise was a design choice instead of a defeat. Ethan took a breath through his nose and pointed shyly. Dad made most of it, except the glass. We got that from Mrs. Peterson. He sank onto a chair and fidgeted with an inhaler, rolling it between his fingers like a talisman. His voice was small but unafraid. Do your crutches hurt your hands? You can have my bike gloves if you want. They have padding. Sophie blinked, surprised by kindness so plain. I'm okay, she said. But thanks. She glanced at the wooden horse on the rail. Did you make that? Ethan shook his head. Dad did. I made the tiny one. He reached to a shelf and produced a horse no bigger than a thumb, its legs impossibly fine, its eye a speck of polished onyx. He held it like a secret. Sophie's face widened in awe. No way. Isabella had seen 1,000 objets d'art placed just so in homes with silent rooms and echoing kitchens. She had commissioned installations from rising sculptors whose agents fought over percentages like wolves. Yet here in a place where the walls rattled when trucks passed, a small boy held something you couldn't buy patience distilled into shape. It's beautiful, she said, and felt the truth of it land in her mouth like a coin dropped into a well. Daniel shrugged, embarrassed. Keeps our hands busy. He shifted his weight. Can I get you something? Water? Coffee? We have tea, I think. We're fine, Isabella said. She meant it. The air smelled faintly of cedar shavings and lemon oil, clean and bright. Hum of the fridge. Distant radio from a neighbor. The notes of an old country song threading the afternoon. For a moment she wished there were fewer witnesses outside, fewer eyes measuring her car against their weeks of lost overtime. Sophie leaned her crutches against the table and carefully lowered herself into a chair. Dad says I can go back to school in a few weeks, she announced, but no running. Or climbing. Or fun. She wrinkled her nose at Daniel. He didn't say the last one. I made it up. Doctors do hate fun, Daniel agreed lightly. Then to Ethan. Show her the puzzle box Bud. Ethan nodded and went to the shelf, pulling down a small wooden cube whose seams were invisible. He set it on the table, tapped one corner, slid a panel, then pressed a hidden key. A compartment popped open with a satisfying click to reveal a tiny folded paper star. He placed it in Sophie's palm with ceremony. My mom used to call it secret-keeping wood, Ethan said softly. The use of past tense rippled the room. He didn't seem to notice, or he did, and move through it like he had learned to move through narrow hallways at night. Dad says every piece of wood has a song, and you just have to listen until you find it. Sophie studied the star as if it were a diamond. Can I keep it? Ethan's eyes flew to Daniel. Daniel nodded. If you promise to make another wish to put inside. Sophie's reply was immediate. I wish Daniel and Ethan could come to our house. It's big, we have stairs, and a piano nobody uses. Isabella felt her spine go rigid. At the same instant, Daniel's shoulders lifted with reflexive refusal. The picture formed in her mind too clearly. Staff waiting, security checking names at the gate. A chef who spoke in measured questions while plating perfection, and somewhere in all that, the ache of being hosted rather than welcomed. Pride is a blade that cuts both ways, she thought, and you can bleed out politely without anyone seeing. Maybe when your leg is stronger, she said evenly, trying to soften the edges. Daniel's mouth thinned. She caught the shift and recognized it even as she despised it, one syllable too careful, one distance maintained too cleanly. She redirected before the silence curdled. Daniel, what are you working on now? He hesitated. His gaze drifted toward a curtained nook, then back. Something for someone who might want it if I can get the grain right. He didn't move. May I? Isabella asked. She didn't know why the question came with a small tremor in her chest. He weighed the privacy of the corner against the simple request and nodded. Sure. She crossed the room and slid the curtain aside. The barn swallow scent of planed oak rose like memory. The piece stood on two trestles under a shop light, a writing desk with long spare lines. The apron cut in a gentle bow, the legs tapered with a restraint that felt like thought rather than stinginess. Tiny inlays, walnut against oak, suggested constellation points along the edges, a map of some sky only the maker knew. The top was unfinished, sanded to silk, waiting for oil or shellac to deepen it into honey. Something inside her loosened and then tightened again, a paradox she had felt only once in a conference room. Lit too brightly, flipping a page of a cold proposal stamped with his name, not understanding then what she was throwing away. Her fingers hovered above the wood but did not touch. It looks... Words failed her. She didn't want to ruin it with the wrong adjective. It looks inevitable, she said finally, like it was always meant to be this way. Daniel's throat moved. Compliments sat awkwardly on him as if he had no place to put them. Sometimes it cooperates, he said. Sometimes it doesn't. I fix mistakes until they look like choices. Isabella stared at the bow of the apron and thought of the bow in her life she kept tightening control precision, a string drawn back until the arrow had nowhere left to go. She could see, too, in the shadowed back of her memory, a file folder more dangerous than a blade. She had chosen once. The choice had cut him. "Who is it for?" she asked, though she suspected he didn't know yet. He shook his head. "Haven't decided." Sophie's voice drifted from the table. "Maybe it's for the person who needs it most." "Maybe so," Daniel said, and the words landed in the small room with a soft weight. Outside, someone laughed. Somewhere a dog barked in 3 quick bursts. A bus sighed to a stop at the corner in a tired exhale. Life moved on around them, indifferent and faithful. Inside, Isabella felt the trapdoor of certainty daring to open beneath her feet. She had come to say thank you and ended up stepping into a chapel built of joint and grain. She turned back, feeling all the watching eyes, Ethan's wide and careful, Sophie's bright and sure. Daniel's alert for the moment the world would demand that he apologize for his own dignity. She wanted to steady something with her hands and found she didn't know what. The old habit rose to fix from far away, to orchestrate solutions like moving capital in the night. It had always been easier to push levers than to say what a truth costs. "Your home is," she began, then let the sentence break and rejoin. "It's beautiful because it was loved into being." Daniel dipped his head as if to accept, though a line of doubt remained between his brows, etched there by years of other people's words. "We do what we can." Sophie tapped the puzzle box again, and the hidden cavity side closed the seam, disappearing. "You should teach me how to make a secret," she said to Ethan. He leaned in unexpectedly, delighted. "You have to promise not to tell anybody where the button is, not even your mom." Isabella lifted a hand in mock offense. "I see how it is." Sophie giggled, and the sound shook loose some delicate invisible filament in the air, a web of suspicion and pride that had stretched between the 4 of them without any of them meaning to build it. They stayed longer than they should have. 10 minutes became 30. 30 became a full hour measured in small things. Ethan's careful instruction, Sophie's exaggerated concentration, Daniel's quiet pride. When something clicked, Isabella's eyes finding and refinding the shape of that desk in the corner like the curve of a question mark. She caught herself imagining the top finished installed near a window where morning light would spill over paper, a place where someone wrote letters that mattered. When she rose to leave, the neighbors were still curious but less sharp about it. The sedan no longer looked like a threat so much as a weather system moving through unnatural brief now passing. At the door, Isabella reached for Daniel's hand and then changed her mind and set a business card on the shelf, instead embarrassed by the impulse, ashamed of the card. The rectangle of smooth stock looked wrong in this room of textures and earned gloss. It felt like an apology translated into a language that hadn't learned how to speak plain. "Thank you for letting us visit," she said. "And for last night." She swallowed. "For showing up." Daniel nodded once. "You're welcome." Sophie hugged Ethan with one arm and reached for her crutches. "We're coming back," she announced with a child's sovereign certainty. "And next time I'm bringing something to put in the secret box." "What?" Ethan asked. Sophie grinned. "A surprise." On the stoop, Isabella glanced back one last time. Her gaze snagged on the desk, on the bowed apron, and the waiting top on possibilities suspended between what was and what might be. Something clicked inside her, quiet, definite, like a hidden panel sliding open. She didn't know yet what exactly had been revealed. She only knew she wanted to see what was behind it. That night, long after the hospital corridors had emptied of footsteps and the trailer park lights had dimmed to scattered pinpricks in the dark, Isabella Grant found herself awake in her home office. The storm had cleared, leaving the sky outside her mansion's windows sharp with stars, but she hardly noticed. Stacks of files sat on her mahogany desk, neat and controlled like everything else in her life. Quarterly reports, acquisition proposals, a new investment pitch waiting for her signature. Yet her eyes kept drifting past all of it, landing instead on the slim folder she had pulled from the back of her filing cabinet. The name written into the corner in fading ink, Daniel Cole Woodworks. Her fingers hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were photographs, the kind that had seemed quaint and outdated when they first crossed her desk 5 years ago. Handcrafted tables, chairs with impossibly elegant joints, a cradle carved with stars along the rail. The accompanying proposal was passionate but simple, a request for modest funding to expand a workshop into a sustainable business. The words were written in a neat, steady hand. At the bottom, a signature, Jacob Daniel Cole. Isabella's chest constricted. It was the same man. The same quiet figure who had carried her daughter through the rain, the same pair of hands Sophie clung to in fear. She had seen those hands before, though, at the time only as images attached to financial projections. She remembered dismissing the plan as romantically unrealistic, a luxury no one needed in a world rushing toward efficiency. She remembered her own exact words. They burned now like iron in her throat. Artisan furniture is a dying market. You should focus on volume, not craft. Her younger self had been sharp, ruthless, determined to prove that a woman could dominate venture capital by cutting as deep as any man. Compassion had seemed weakness. Dreams had been liabilities. And so she had rejected him, moving on to the next file, the next promising number, the next cold calculation. Now, 5 years later, she had seen where that decision had left him, living in a trailer, piecing together odd jobs, his son wheezing with asthma, while his wife lay beneath a grave he could barely afford to keep. And still, even now, his work sang. She had seen the unfinished desk in the corner, its lines flawless, its joinery confident, its beauty undeniable. Time and hardship had not dimmed his talent. If anything, they had honed it. She pressed her palm against the photo of the cradle as though touch could erase the choice she once made. But the guilt was sharper than any wood grain beneath her hand. A memory returned unbidden. Her maiden name Cole, spoken at a family reunion long ago. She had left it behind, trading it for Grant in marriage, reclaiming it only after divorce. Now here was another Cole standing before her like some mirror she had not expected. She wondered if fate had been waiting all along, circling back with cruel precision. Down the hall, Sophie's soft breathing carried through the monitors she still insisted on using, even though her daughter was nearly 9. Isabella rose, walking to the doorway of the child's room. Sophie slept soundly. One arm flung across the blanket, the faint outline of Ethan's tiny wooden horse clutched in her fingers. The toy gleamed in the nightlight, rough edges, smoothed by a boy's patient sanding. Isabella's throat tightened. Her daughter had never shown such attachment to store-bought gifts, no matter how extravagant. But one carved horse from a boy in a trailer had won her heart. Returning to her office, Isabella stared at the folder again. For years, she had measured worth by profit margins, by how much a deal could return in 5 quarters. Yet Daniel Cole had built value of another kind, quiet, enduring, made with hands that still believed wood could be coaxed into memory. She had dismissed it, and in dismissing it, dismissed him. She sank into her leather chair and pressed her fingers to her temples. She had told herself countless times that every rejection was just business, nothing personal, that people who failed had done so because they weren't strong enough. But tonight those lies tasted sour. For the first time, she felt the weight of what her pen had destroyed. Her phone buzzed with a calendar alert. She silenced it. Numbers and meetings no longer mattered. What mattered was a man who had once asked for a chance and a decision that had helped shape the ruin of his life. She whispered into the quiet, though no one could hear her, "I'm sorry." But apologies carried little weight when years of loss stood in their wake. The next morning, Isabella returned to the hospital with flowers for Sophie and coffee she would never admit was for Daniel. He wasn't there. The chair beside Sophie's bed sat empty, still warm with the memory of his presence. "Where's Daniel?" Sophie asked groggily, her small hand searching the sheets. "He had to go home to Ethan," Isabella said, gently smoothing the blanket. Her daughter's eyes opened wider. "Then we should go there. Please, Mom, I want to see them again." Isabella's resolve faltered. She was used to dictating terms, used to deciding what was reasonable. But Sophie's voice carried a truth she could not ignore. She nodded, her heart already bracing for the collision she knew was coming, the collision between who she had been and who she needed to become. Later that evening, she found herself once more in Riverside Mobile Park. The Mercedes hummed along the gravel drawing stairs. Trailer 37 appeared again, humble and unyielding. This time she carried no excuse of her daughter's pleading. This time she carried the folder. When Daniel opened the door, his face was wary, guarded. Ethan hovered nearby, clutching his inhaler like a shield. Isabella drew a steady breath, holding the folder out like a confession. 5 years ago, she began, "You sent this to my firm." Daniel's eyes dropped to the familiar cover. His entire body stiffened. "I turned you down," she continued, forcing each word. "And I remember exactly why." The silence that followed was knife-sharp. Daniel's hand hovered near the folder but didn't take it. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, as though dragged through gravel. "You remember I do," Isabella admitted. "And I was wrong." The bitterness in his laugh was quiet but cutting. He stepped back as if the memory itself struck harder than rain. "Wrong. That word doesn't cover it." Isabella held her ground. "I know." Daniel's eyes burned into hers, and in them she saw all the weight of nights in hospital rooms, all the pain of selling a dream to buy another breath for a dying wife. She saw the collapse she had helped accelerate with one cold decision. "Because of you," he said, voice breaking in its quiet fury, "I lost everything, and she still died." "Do you remember that part?" Isabella's chest seized. The words landed like hammer blows. She wanted to speak, to explain, to beg. But for once, the woman who always had the perfect answer stood speechless in the face of the truth. And Daniel Cole turned away, his shoulders rigid, leaving her with the folder in her hand and the echo of her own past in the air. The slam of the trailer door echoed in Isabella's chest long after it shut her out. The cool evening air clung to her skin, thick with the smell of wet earth and faint wood smoke from neighbors' chimneys. Gravel crunched under her heels as she stood there, folder in hand, realizing the futility of what she had just tried. She had walked into Daniel's world with an apology she thought might mean something, only to find that words were far too light against the weight of 5 years of suffering. From behind the thin walls, muffled sounds filtered out, the low murmur of Daniel's voice, Ethan's wheezing laugh, the clink of wood against wood. Ordinary family sounds. They cut deeper than any accusation. Isabella returned to her Mercedes, sliding into the leather seat that suddenly felt more like a barrier than a comfort. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened, staring at the reflection of her own face in the windshield. Controlled, composed, successful. Yet beneath the gloss, she saw cracks she hadn't dared acknowledge. She thought of Daniel's eyes when he spat those words. "Because of you, I lost everything." They were not the eyes of a man merely struggling. They were the eyes of someone who had been broken and had learned to keep walking anyway. The car engine purred to life, but she didn't drive. She sat there, rain tapping faintly on the roof, and wondered if redemption was possible for people who had traded empathy for ambition. Inside the trailer, Daniel sank into his single kitchen chair, the one he had built years ago from reclaimed oak. His hands trembled slightly, fists unclenching only when Ethan climbed into his lap, inhaler still clutched tight. "Who was that, Dad?" the boy asked softly. Daniel smoothed his son's hair, staring at the folder still resting on the counter. The sight of his own handwriting on the proposal had been like a knife to the ribs. All those nights spent drafting financial projections by lamplight, all those photographs of pieces he had poured his soul into it, had all come back like a flood. And there she was, the woman who had dismissed it all, standing in his doorway with expensive perfume and guilt in her eyes. "She's nobody," he muttered, though the words rang hollow. Ethan tilted his head, sensing the untruth, but said nothing. Silence filled the trailer, broken only by the boy's soft breaths and the hum of the old refrigerator. Daniel stared at the folder a long while before finally shoving it into a drawer, burying the past where it belonged. Or so he told himself. The next days blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion. He patched another fence, mended a neighbor's porch step, sanded the unfinished desk in the corner whenever he had the energy. Bills piled higher on the counter. A letter from the cemetery arrived, its red-stamped warning like a wound, pay the balance or Sarah's grave would be moved. The number $743 might as well have been 7,000. That night, Daniel sat at the table with the letter spread before him. Ethan worked quietly beside him on a new carving tongue pressed to his lip in concentration. The boy's small hands guided the knife with the care of a surgeon. Each curl of wood that fell seemed to carry away a fragment of the tension pressing down on them. But Daniel could not shake the storm inside. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he had whispered into her hair before the cancer stole her breath. "I'll take care of him. I'll keep him safe." He had meant every word, yet here he was failing to afford even her grave. When Ethan finally looked up, his eyes were full of questions too heavy for his age. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He forced a smile, brushing sawdust from his son's cheek. "Yeah, buddy, we're going to be okay." But his voice cracked just enough that Ethan lowered his gaze, unconvinced. Isabella, meanwhile, was not done wrestling with her conscience. In her office late at night, she pulled out Daniel's folder again and again, unable to shove it back into the shadows. She remembered her own rise, how she had clawed her way into boardrooms full of men who doubted her, how she had hardened herself into steel so their words would not pierce. But at what cost? Her daughter had asked her an innocent question earlier that evening, one that left her breathless. Why doesn't Daniel live in a big house like us if he can make things that beautiful? Isabella had no answer. She poured herself a glass of wine, but it tasted bitter. Instead, she paced the echo of her heels against marble, a reminder of how far she'd built herself from the girl who once lived closer to Daniel's world than to this one. She remembered nights of counting coins with her parents, of praying rent would clear of fear, clawing at her belly like hunger. She had sworn she'd never go back, but she had also sworn she wouldn't forget. And yet she had forgotten, hadn't she? Forgotten that each proposal denied carried a family's way to dreams' collapse. Forgotten that behind numbers were faces. The guilt kept her awake until dawn. Back in the trailer, Daniel lay awake too, staring at the ceiling while Ethan slept fitfully, wheezing in the bunk above. The storm outside had quieted, but inside his chest another raged. He could not shake the image of Isabella standing in his doorway, her confession spilling into the air like broken glass. He hated her for it, and yet a part of him couldn't stop replaying the look in her eyes, the look of someone who wasn't just guilty, but haunted. He turned to the unfinished desk, its pale wood glowing faintly in the lamplight. It was beautiful, yes, but also useless. No one would buy it. No one in his world could afford to. Still, he sanded its smoothing edges until his hands burned because the work was the only thing that quieted the grief. He whispered to the empty room as if Sarah could hear him through the veil, "I'm trying. God knows I'm trying." The words fell flat, lost in the quiet hum of the night, and across town in a mansion lined with marble and glass. Isabella Grant stared sleepless at her ceiling too, realizing that for the first time in years, her money couldn't buy her peace. Morning light slipped into the trailer through thin curtains painting narrow lines across Daniel's weary face. He had barely slept. The letter from the cemetery still sat on the table where he'd left it, the red ink a wound that refused to heal. $743 stood between his wife's grave and indignity. He rubbed his eyes and whispered to the silence, "How much more can they take from us?" Ethan stirred in the bunk above, coughing himself awake. The boy's breath rasped, shallow but steady, once his inhaler hissed relief into his lungs. Daniel watched his son's small chest rise and fall, and a familiar guilt pressed harder. He was behind on rent. He was behind on medication. He was behind on life itself. By mid-morning, Daniel was back at work. Mrs. Peterson had asked him to fix a section of sagging fence. $25 cash. Enough for groceries if he stretched it. He hammered and sawed while sweat mixed with the memory of rain, his thoughts never far from the stack of bills waiting at home. The day blurred into aching muscles and the metallic tang of desperation. When he returned to the trailer that evening, Ethan was hunched over the table carving a block of pine. His tongue peeked from the corner of his mouth, concentration etched across his young face. Daniel forced a smile. "Looks good, buddy." "It's a horse," Ethan said softly, holding up the half-formed figure, "like the one I showed Sophie." Daniel's chest tightened at the name. Sophie. Her cast. Her laughter despite the pain. The way she had clung to his hand as if it were the only steady thing in the world. And then uninvited Isabella's face intruded, impeccable, composed unraveling when she thought no one could see. He shook his head, trying to push her out. She didn't belong here, but she was already tied to him by invisible strings. 2 days later, the phone rang. Daniel almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant collectors. Still, something made him pick up. Mr. Cole. A polished voice, calm and certain. This is Adrian Wu with the Bark Ridge Artisan Collective. We've heard of your work and are very interested in meeting you. Daniel froze. His grip tightened on the receiver. How did you hear about me? Word travels among craftsmen and patrons, Wu replied smoothly. Your reputation precedes you. We believe there's a market for what you create, real craftsmanship, not machine-made imitation. We'd like to discuss an investment partnership. The words felt too good, too rehearsed. Daniel's first instinct was suspicion. He thought instantly of Isabella, her guilty eyes, her presence in his trailer. Was this her doing? Was this charity dressed as opportunity? Look, Daniel said carefully, I'm not in a position to... We're prepared to fund a workshop. Wu interrupted gently. Provide proper tools, materials, even a living stipend while you establish yourself. All we ask in return is exclusivity. You would retain creative control, but we would handle distribution. Daniel's heart hammered. He imagined the desk in the corner finished displayed in a showroom instead of gathering dust. He imagined Ethan breathing easier in a home with clean air, a room of his own medicine always on hand. But pride stabbed sharp. He had been burned before. He had been rejected and left to drown. Was this salvation or another trap? Send me the details in writing, he said finally, his voice firm. Of course, Wu agreed smoothly. We'll arrange a meeting tomorrow. In the meantime, consider this a chance to reclaim what you've lost. After the call ended, Daniel sat in silence staring at the wall. His hands shook. Hope was dangerous. Hope had betrayed him before. Ethan patted over, holding out the small wooden horse. You look scared, Dad. Daniel swallowed hard, wrapping his son's fingers around the carving again. Maybe I am. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat at the table, bills spread before him like a jury. The cemetery notice glared red. The pharmacy reminder sat unopened. His truck needed repairs. His son needed medicine. And then in the corner, the unfinished desk seemed to glow, waiting, daring him to believe. He whispered to the darkness, Sarah, what would you tell me? Take the risk or walk away. The silence answered with the tick of the clock, the steady rasp of his son's breathing, the weight of everything unsaid. Meanwhile, across town in her mansion of marble floors and high windows, Isabella sat in her study phone pressed to her ear. Did he bite? She asked quietly. On the other end, Adrian Wu's voice was calm, cautious, but yes. He'll meet tomorrow. Isabella closed her eyes, relief rushing in like a tide. She swirled the wine in her glass, but didn't drink. Good. He deserves this chance. He just can't know it comes from me. Understood. The line went dead, leaving Isabella alone with her reflection in the dark window. For the first time in years, the woman staring back at her did not look untouchable. She looked human, haunted, unsure if redemption was something one could orchestrate or something that had to be earned the hard way. And in the silence, with the storm clouds gathering again in the distance, two lives moved closer to colliding once more, one grasping for a chance, the other desperate to give it without being seen. The next morning broke damp and gray mist clinging low over Millbrook like a veil the sun was too tired to lift. Daniel pulled on his flannel shirt, its elbows worn thin, and tried to ignore the way his stomach twisted. He had agreed to a meeting, though every instinct screamed caution. Still, what choice did he have? He couldn't keep patching fences forever, not when Ethan's medicine and Sarah's grave weighed heavier each day. Ethan sat at the table leg, swinging inhaler beside him like a faithful companion. He chewed on toast while watching his father pace. What's wrong, Dad? Daniel forced a smile. Just a meeting today. Some folks who want to see my work. Like, buy it. Ethan's eyes lit. Maybe Daniel said, though his voice carried the hesitation of a man braced for disappointment. He ruffled his son's hair and added quietly, Don't get your hopes too high, buddy. Sometimes things that sound good turn out not to be. Ethan nodded solemnly, the way only children who have seen too much hardship can. By noon, Daniel stood outside a small cafe on Main Street. He wiped his palms on his jeans as a sleek sedan pulled up. From it stepped a man in a tailored suit, not flashy but precise. Adrian Wu was younger than Daniel had expected, maybe early 40s, with calm eyes and a confidence that seemed practiced but genuine. Mr. Cole Wu greeted warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting me." Daniel shook it wary but polite. "You said you wanted to see my work." "I do." Wu gestured toward the truck parked nearby. "Do you have any pieces with you?" Daniel led him to the bed of the pickup where, wrapped in a tarp, the unfinished desk lay like a patient waiting for surgery. Wu's eyes widened the moment he saw it. He ran his fingers gently along the bow of the apron, the dovetail joints, the constellation-like inlays. "This is extraordinary," Wu murmured. "Hand-cut joints, perfect symmetry. Do you know how rare this is now?" Daniel crossed his arms. "Rare doesn't pay the bills." Wu looked up sharply as if measuring the man before him. Then he nodded. "That's exactly why we're interested. There's a market for authenticity for heirloom pieces. People are tired of mass production. They're willing to pay a premium for craftsmanship like this." The words were exactly what Daniel wanted to believe, but they landed too neatly, too rehearsed. He narrowed his eyes. "Why me? There are other craftsmen out there." Wu smiled, unbothered. "Because your name came up more than once. People remember your shop. Even in failure, reputation lingers. And frankly, Mr. Cole, your circumstances make you undervalued. You're a hidden treasure. That's the kind of investment our collective looks for." Daniel bristled at the word circumstances. He heard what wasn't said, poor, broken, desperate. He had lived long enough to recognize pity dressed as business. But then Wu spoke again, his tone shifting. "We would provide a workshop, fully equipped, professional grade, a cottage beside it for you and your son, a monthly stipend to cover essentials while you rebuild. In exchange, exclusivity, all your work marketed through our collective for 3 years. You keep creative control, we handle business and distribution." Daniel's breath caught. The offer was almost absurd in its generosity. Too perfect, too clean. He felt his pride flare a shield against hope. "Sounds like charity," he said flatly. Wu shook his head. "No, it's partnership. You bring the craft, we bring the reach. And if you succeed, we succeed. That's business." Daniel looked away, jaw tight. He could see Ethan's face in his mind eyes, wide chest rattling, small hands building toys with dull blades because proper tools were too expensive. He thought of Sarah's grave and the cruel letter threatening to move her. Pride was a luxury. Ethan's future wasn't. "I'll need to see everything in writing," he said finally. "Of course," Wu replied smoothly. "I'll send the contracts tomorrow." They parted with a handshake, but Daniel's chest remained tight. He drove back to the trailer, the road winding past the cemetery. He pulled in without meaning to. Sarah's stone stood quiet among others, the grass damp with dew. Daniel crouched before it, pressing his palm to the granite. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "This feels too easy, too convenient, like the moment I let myself believe someone's going to take it away again." The wind rustled through the trees, the sound hauntingly like Sarah's voice in the kitchen when she used to ground him. "Take care of Ben first. Everything else is noise." Daniel bowed, his head eyes burning. "I'm trying, love. I don't know if this is the right way." That evening, he worked late on the desk, sanding until his arms ached. Ethan sat nearby sorting tools, his excitement palpable. "Does this mean we might have a real shop again, Dad?" "Maybe," Daniel said, forcing a measured tone. "But remember what I told you. Sometimes things sound too good to be true." Ethan studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "But sometimes they're true anyway." The boy's words cut through Daniel's armor, leaving him raw. He reached out, pulling Ethan into a rough hug, breathing in the scent of sawdust in his hair. For the first time in years, he let himself imagine a future not defined by survival, but by creation. Across town, Isabella sat in her own office phone in hand. Wu's message blinked on the screen. "He'll sign if the terms check out." Relief surged, though it was laced with fear. She was manipulating the man she had once destroyed, giving him back his dream while hiding the strings. "Forgive me, Daniel," she whispered to the empty room. "You'll hate me for this if you find out. But I'd rather you hate me and succeed than never get another chance at all." Outside her window, the first stars pierced the night sky, faint but stubborn like promises daring to shine through the dark. The contracts arrived 4 days later, hand-delivered in a crisp leather folder that looked absurdly out of place against the chipped paint of Daniel's trailer door. Ethan was the first to spot the courier. He had pressed his face to the window and whispered, "Dad, there's a man in a suit." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door. The courier offered the folder with a polite smile, then vanished back into his spotless car, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne that lingered uneasily in the air. Daniel set the folder on the table as though it were a fragile bomb. He stared at it for long minutes, Ethan watching with wide eyes. Finally, he flipped it open. Every detail was there, just as Wu had promised. A fully funded workshop, a cottage, a stipend, and exclusivity for 3 years. The legal language was dense, but without traps. He read it twice, searching for hidden clause, but found none. If anything, the terms leaned in his favor, too much so. It felt unreal, too easy. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone at the table, the contract spread before him under the glow of a single lamp. The cemetery notice lay beside it, its red ink screaming louder now. Sarah's grave. His son's medicine. Rent overdue. His pride screamed at him not to sign, but desperation pressed the pen toward his hand. He rubbed his temples. He needed advice. But the only person he could imagine talking to was long gone. His eyes lifted toward the photo of Sarah on the wall, her smile frozen in time. "What do I do, love?" he whispered. "Do I take the chance, even if it comes from hands I don't trust?" The trailer creaked in the wind. Silence was the only answer. The following evening, a knock rattled the thin door. When Daniel opened it, Sophie stood there on crutches, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Behind her was a young woman, Maria, her babysitter, watching from the car. "Hi, Daniel," Sophie chirped. "Mom had a dinner thing, but I begged to come. I wanted to see Ethan." Ethan, already peering out from behind his father's leg, lit up. He darted forward, shyness forgotten, waving the small wooden horse he had finished carving. "Look, Sophie." I made another. Sophie's eyes widened. "It's beautiful. Better than the last one." The children's laughter filled the cramped space, displacing the gloom that had settled there. For a moment, Daniel let himself breathe easier. But then Sophie unzipped her backpack with a flourish. "I brought something," she announced, pulling out a wrapped package. The paper peeled back to reveal a gleaming set of carving tools. Sharp chisels, precision knives. Sanders, the kind Daniel had coveted for years but could never afford. Ethan gasped, his small hands trembling as he touched the tools reverently. "They're perfect," he whispered. Daniel's stomach clenched. He stepped forward quickly, his voice rough. "Sophie, these are too much. I can't let you." "It was my idea," Sophie cut in. "I told Mom Ethan was an artist, and she said real artists need real tools." Daniel froze. "Isabella." "Of course." He crouched down, his eyes level with Sophie's. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't bring gifts like this. It's too much." Sophie's lower lip trembled, and Daniel felt his resolve falter. Ethan stood clutching one of the chisels, his face glowing in a way Daniel hadn't seen in months. The boy's excitement was pure, untainted, a light in the dark. To crush it would be cruel. Daniel exhaled slowly, finding a middle ground. "All right, but only if you promise to thank your mom for me, and tell her she doesn't need to do this again." "Okay." Sophie nodded vigorously, relief washing over her. That night, long after Sophie had left, Daniel sat watching Ethan test the tools the boy's small hands steady as he carved details into the wooden horse. His face glowed with joy, with possibility. Daniel leaned back, heart aching. His pride had always been his armor, but now he wondered if that armor was trapping Ethan in the same cycle of scarcity. Perhaps pride had to bend if his son was to breathe freely again. When Ethan finally fell asleep, chisels still clutched in his hands, Daniel made his decision. He picked up the pen and signed the contract. He sealed the envelope ready for tomorrow's courier. He whispered into the still night, his voice both prayer and surrender. "I hope this is the right choice." Across town, Isabella sat in her study phone pressed to her ear. Wu's calm voice reported, "He signed." Relief swept through her chest, but so did unease. She had orchestrated everything from the shadows, but deception was still deception. She stared at Sophie's crayon drawing on the wall, a sketch of Ethan and his wooden toys, bright and simple. "Please don't hate me when you find out," Isabella whispered into the quiet. "I just wanted to give you back what I once took away." Outside, the storm clouds had cleared. But in both Daniel's trailer and Isabella's mansion, the air still hummed with tension, the kind that precedes the next inevitable clash. The morning the courier returned to collect the signed contract, Daniel stood at the doorway with the envelope in hand. His fingers lingered on it as though releasing it meant surrendering more than paper. The man in the pressed suit accepted it with a polite nod, slipping it into his briefcase before disappearing down the gravel road. Daniel shut the door, leaned his forehead against the frame, and exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For better or worse, his choice was made. Ethan padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Did you do it?" "Dad?" Daniel nodded. "I did." "Does that mean—" Ethan's voice trailed with cautious hope. Daniel crouched, meeting his son's gaze. "It means things might change. We'll have to wait and see." Ethan broke into a grin, clutching the new chisel to his chest like treasure. For the first time in a long while, Daniel let himself return the smile. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Ethan stood in front of a renovated barn on the outskirts of town. The structure gleamed with fresh paint and sturdy beams, its wide doors thrown open to reveal row upon row of gleaming tools, stacks of fine lumber, and benches large enough to spread out his biggest projects. The smell of sawdust and varnish already hung in the air, warm and welcoming. Ethan's eyes went round. "It's huge," he cried, darting from station to station, running his hands over clamps and planes as though they were toys in a wonderland. "Dad, it's like magic." Daniel's throat tightened. He trailed a hand along the polished workbench, his heart pounding with disbelief. Everything he had once lost, everything he had thought gone forever, stood before him, resurrected. Wu appeared at his side, calm as ever. "This is yours now. A proper space for a craftsman. Your cottage is through there." He pointed toward a small 2-bedroom home tucked behind the barn smoke, curling lazily from its chimney. Daniel swallowed hard words, failing him. His hands trembled as he touched the edge of the bench again. "It's more than I expected. It's what you deserve," Wu said simply. That evening, Daniel carried Ethan over the threshold of their new cottage. The boy immediately claimed the smaller room, spreading his carvings across the desk, as if to christen the space. Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring at cupboards that weren't empty, at walls that weren't cracked. For the first time in years, he felt stability beneath his feet. But as night fell, unease returned. Too perfect. Too generous. He thought of Isabella again, of the way she had looked at him in the hospital, guilt etched deep in her features. Was she behind this? Was his pride being tricked into swallowing charity dressed as opportunity? He couldn't know. Not yet. Days turned into weeks. Orders flowed in through the collective custom dining tables, heirloom cabinets, intricate chairs. Daniel worked with a vigor he hadn't felt in years. His hands remembered. His body remembered. Each piece he crafted carried Sarah's memory. Each dovetail joint, a quiet promise to Ethan that their future would be different. The boy thrived. His breathing eased in the cleaner air. His cheeks grew less pale. His laughter returned in bursts that filled the cottage. Daniel sometimes caught him sitting by the window, sketching ideas for new carvings, dreaming in ways Daniel hadn't dared since before Sarah's illness. One afternoon, while polishing the surface of a walnut table, Daniel heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He stepped out into the sunlight and froze. The black Mercedes was back. Isabella stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. She wore no business armor this time, no sharp suit, no perfectly pinned hair, just dark jeans, a simple blouse, and eyes that carried both hesitation and resolve. Daniel's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" She took a breath. "To see the workshop, and to thank you again for saving Sophie." "You've already done enough," he said sharply. Her eyes flickered, but she held his gaze. "Daniel, I know you don't trust me. You have every reason not to. But Sophie keeps asking about Ethan. She misses him. As if on cue, Ethan emerged from the cottage, his carving knife still in hand. His eyes lit at the sight of Sophie, who hobbled out of the car on her crutches, her cast now scrawled with signatures and doodles. Ethan, she called, waving. The boy ran to her excitement, erasing hesitation. They bent together over the latest carving laughter spilling into the air like sunlight breaking clouds. Daniel's chest ached. He wanted to push Isabella away to tell her she had no place here. Yet seeing their children together unburdened by pride or class or history, something inside him softened. Isabella stepped closer, her voice low. They don't see the walls we've built. Maybe we shouldn't either. Daniel studied her conflict raging behind his eyes. Finally, he turned back toward the barn. Fine, come in. But don't expect me to forget. She nodded. I wouldn't ask you to. Inside the barn smelled of fresh shavings and promise. Isabella walked slowly, trailing her hand along a finished chair, her fingers trembling slightly. It's beautiful, she whispered. You've always had a gift. Daniel's jaw clenched. Funny. That's not what you said 5 years ago. The words cut, but Isabella didn't flinch. She turned to face him fully, her voice quiet but steady. I was wrong, and I will spend as long as it takes trying to make it right. Their eyes locked his with years of anger and survival, hers with guilt and determination. Between them, the children's laughter rose clear and bright, weaving through the rafters like music neither could ignore. Isabella drove away from the barn with the window cracked and the smell of cedar shavings still clinging to her hair like a benediction she hadn't earned. Gravel hissed under the tires. Out beyond the fields, the evening spread in bands of lavender and tangerine, and the wind moved through the grasses like a hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. She kept both hands at 10 and 2, the posture of a woman who trusted control more than grace. Back in the workshop, the day thinned into gold. Daniel set a finished chair on the bench and stood back, head cocked, body still. The thing looked simple, almost plain, until you noticed the curve of the back rail, the way it invited the shoulder blades to rest, the way each tenon sat like a promise snug in its mortise. He reached for a rag and burnished the edge with slow, small circles. Ethan and Sophie leaned in foreheads, nearly touching the cast on Sophie's leg, scribbled with doodles, and a single neat signature, Ethan, carved with a carpenter's pencil, like a vow. Now Sophie whispered, eyes wide, to the ritual. Now Daniel said. He lifted the chair and let it kiss the floor. No wobble. The sound was a soft, certain thud, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. Outside the open doors, the Mercedes had vanished down the lane, but Isabella hadn't left them entirely. She turned onto the county road and pulled over beneath a cottonwood where the bars on her phone held steady at 3. Adrian, she said when the call clicked alive, bumped the coal pieces to the front page of the catalog, but no feature story. I don't want a spotlight, just placement, quiet and unmistakable. Yes, Ms. Grant Wu said. The umber warmth of his voice was a balm against her nerves. We can do a designer spotlight without naming benefactors. No spotlight, she repeated. Let the work speak, raise the prices to where they should be, and see if Mrs. Avram's interior team in Tribeca is still hunting that long table she wanted old-world joinery without the museum plaque. Daniel's ash slab would make her cry. A pause. Understood. Also, one of the boutique hotels in Jackson wants 3 benches for the lobby. Your call. Take it, she said. But stagger deliveries. I don't want Daniel drowning in promises. You're protecting him, Wu said gently. I'm protecting the work, she lied, then closed her eyes because lies sounded thinner now, easier to tear. In the barn, late light lifted sawdust into the air like snowfall. Daniel showed the kids how to read grain with fingertips, not just eyes. See how it runs east to west. He tilted a board and sunlight found the cathedrals. Push a chisel across it wrong, and the wood will punish you. Push with it, and it sings. What does oak sing? Sophie asked, palm tentatively on the board, as if listening for a heartbeat. Bread and windows, Ethan said, solemn. It smells like toast when it gets warm, and like when Dad opens the kitchen window in summer. Sophie tried it, eyes closed. Oh, she breathed. Now I hear it. Daniel watched them in the glass of the window, 2 heads bent together, one dark, one fair. He didn't look at Isabella's empty parking spot. He didn't have to. Her presence lingered like the echo of a piano key after the finger lifts. Days took on a gentle architecture. Morning coffee in the cottage, Ethan in socked feet drawing horses with impossible ankles. Midday deliveries, a bench wrapped like a gift in brown paper, a console table strapped into the truck like a patient in transit. Afternoon. The kids at the workbench. Sophie learning to sand without leaving tracks. Ethan explaining the algebra of hidden compartments. Evenings, pasta and jarred sauce homework at the kitchen table. Oil rags sealed in a metal can, a lullaby of crickets and distant highway, like an old record with a scratch you learned to love. Money started moving. Not a flood, never that, but a river wide enough to float dignity. Daniel wrote a check to the cemetery for $743 and pressed his thumb against the line where his name looked stronger than it felt. He mailed it at the post office with a quiet, private steadiness, then took Ethan for pie at Dottie's like people who celebrated in small, sugar-fueled ways. The first coal piece to travel far went to New York. A courier arrived with white gloves and a padded crate, eyebrows rising when he saw the source. A barn, not a showroom. A man in a clean flannel, not a salesman in a tie. Daniel and Ethan carried the table to the truck bed with a choreography they had learned together over years of moving more sorrow than wood. Sophie limped alongside, one hand steady on the crate, a serious helper. When the tailgate slammed, the sound rang like a bell. Ethan waved until the courier's van turned out of sight. "Do you think they'll eat around it?" he asked, face earnest. "Like a family." "I think," Daniel said. His voice caught between hope and a tremor he wouldn't name. "They'll pass bread and not realize they're touching something someone made for them." In the city, a designer set that table in a room that held too much white for comfort, and when the afternoon sun crossed it, light fell into the grain in a way that made a woman in a black dress stand very still and say, "Oh." But Daniel would never see that, and the work didn't need him to. At a staff meeting uptown, Isabella clicked her pen closed to stop herself from signing something she didn't want. A junior partner pushed a roll-up strategy to absorb a family lumber mill. "We can grind them down on delivery timelines and buy the debt at a discount," he said, smiling like a man who had never watched anyone lose a house. "No," Isabella said. "Crisp. We'll offer fair terms or nothing. People remember who saved them and who made them bleed." The room shifted a surprise ripple. A few eyes flicked toward her, recalculating. She didn't care. She thought of a man in a barn who burnished edges until they gave back a little light, of a boy whose breathing steadied when the air smelled like sap, of a girl who slept with a wooden horse beside her cheek. She signed a different set of papers that afternoon, a sponsorship for a vocational school's woodworking program, a small grant to the clinic near Riverside for pediatric respiratory care. She deleted her name from the notes. Let it move as weather does, felt, but not seen. She tried not to park on the lane by the barn on the days she came, but sometimes she did. She'd stop short of the fence, cut the engine, and listen. Laughter spilled out to her like music from a porch she didn't yet deserve. In those moments, she became a mother first, a benefactor second, a penitent always. When Sophie begged to go in, Isabella went in. When Sophie bent over Ethan's shoulder to watch a puzzle lid slide open, Isabella stood with her hands behind her back because she didn't trust them not to touch. One evening, Daniel was planing the edge of a cherry board when Isabella stepped inside. She had a paper bag in one hand, bakery cookies still warm, and her body held the hesitance of someone knocking without knuckles. The plane sang. Curled ribbons of wood fell in perfect coils to the floor. Isabella watched, rapt, and then because her mind was a magpie for patterns, she named the song without meaning to. "You're going with a French polish on the top, aren't you?" she asked quietly. "Shellac and oil. It looks like honey in winter light." Daniel's hand stilled. The plane hovered like a held breath. He turned. Not many people would guess that. "I read," she said, a small, embarrassed half-smile. "Sometimes at 3 a.m. She didn't say what his old proposal marked in her notes with the words she'd used to kill it. "Research done too late, feels like prayer." He set the plane down the metal-kissing wood. "Oil is forgiving," he said. "It lets you touch a piece again years later and mend the dull places." "And varnish?" she asked. "Varnish is certainty," he said. "Protection so solid you forget there's something living under it." Sophie broke the delicate wire of that moment by announcing she could now sand without leaving stripes. Ethan confirmed this with the solemnity of an expert witness. They set to their work again, and Isabella moved carefully through the barn, setting the paper bag on a shelf, glancing at the crates stacked by the door. A moth logo Barkridge's mark graced each shipping label, its geometry eerily close to the one her brand team liked to use on seasonal portfolios. Daniel's eyes lingered on it too. She saw the flicker there, and intellection sparked a suspicion that had not yet found a name. Those benches, he said, nodding to a sketch tacked to the wall. Jackson wanted 3 Woo's last email flared in Isabella's memory. Yes, she said, keeping her voice level. They loved the sample. They, Daniel said, neutral, whoever they are. She nodded. Whoever they are. Later at a school open house, fate choreographed a collision more ordinary and more difficult than hospitals or storms. The gym smelled like crayons and disinfectant, and posters drooped at the corners over folding tables. A small crowd formed when Ethan's teacher laid out the students' simple machines projects. Ethan's was a wooden crane with a hand-carved pulley. It lifted a pencil with a grace that made one father laugh in delight, and then cough to hide that he'd almost clapped. Beautiful work, the teacher said to Daniel. It was not lost on anyone that she said it to him, as if the boy's hands and the man's hands were the same story in different tenses. Across the table, 2 mothers whispered about the Mercedes in the parking lot and the man in the flannel who smelled like orange oil. Isabella stood between them and made eye contact so cleanly it cut. They looked away. She moved to Daniel's side without ceremony. Best one here, she murmured, watching the crane swing. And I've underwritten robotics teams. It's just wood and string, he said, though the corner of his mouth betrayed how much the praise cost and how much it gave. Sometimes the simplest levers move the heaviest things, she said. He looked at her a glance that felt like a ruler measuring tolerances. The line between what he owed her and what he did not owe anyone sharpened. He said nothing. She pretended not to notice and cheered when Sophie perched on her crutches like a small queen held up Ethan's pencil as if it were a flag. The weeks clicked forward, a sequence of small increments like the teeth of a gear. Daniel learned the particular silence of the barn at night, when the last light bled out of the west and the rafters held the day's heat like a sleeping animal. Sometimes when Ethan had drifted off and even the radio had gone quiet, he'd stand at the unfinished writing desk, his white whale, his confessional. He'd lay his palms flat and close his eyes and try to feel when it wanted to be finished. Not yet, the wood said. Not yet. Isabella, in her car in the lane, watched him through the wash of her own breath on glass. She wanted to tell him. Every time she came, she wanted to put the truth on the bench like a crooked board and say, "Help me plane it straight." Every time she swallowed it back and told herself she was protecting the work, the children, the fragile truce, but the lie became heavier, like clamps left on overnight. One night after the kids had been bundled into the cottage with hot cocoa and a cartoon, she lingered in the doorway of the barn while Daniel wiped his hands. The light made a halo out of the floating dust. "Do you ever worry," she asked, "that a piece will never forgive you for starting it?" He looked at the desk. "All the time." "What makes you know when it's ready, when it belongs to itself?" he said. "Not to me. I stop when I can't hear my voice in it anymore." She stood very still. The air between them hummed with something not yet named. "I'm trying," she said. So quiet, he almost didn't hear it. Daniel's eyes flicked to the shipping labels, to the moth, to the clean corners of the contracts he reread on bad nights, searching for shadows. He nodded once, a motion that could mean anything, that he'd heard her, that he understood nothing, that he'd decided to let tomorrow carry what he couldn't. He turned back to the desk and set a fingertip in a swirl of dust, drawing a tiny constellation. She recognized it before she knew why. 3 points, then 2, then 1. Orion's belt offset by a star that shouldn't be there. The same pattern had lived in a margin of an old proposal once upon a time, doodled by a man dreaming out loud on paper he hoped would change his life. Isabella's mouth opened, then closed. She stepped back into the cool dark, the cookies forgotten on the shelf, and let the night hide her as the barn light clicked off. That week, a padded envelope arrived with a remittance from Barkridge, tidy and generous and almost suspiciously prompt. Daniel slid it with a shop knife and lifted out the check. He stared. The amount was correct. The signature at the bottom belonged to an administrative officer he didn't know. Beneath it in faint watermark, a holding company name, he did Grant and Morrison Holdings, the sort of entity that quietly owned quiet pieces of many things. His thumb paused over the letters. He felt the floor tilt as if the barn had sighed. Out the window, Ethan and Sophie were laughing in the yard, the sound lifting into a sky as blue and blank as a gessoed panel waiting for the first mark. Daniel folded the check and slid it back into the envelope without a word. He set it on the workbench beside the unfinished desk, beside the rag that smelled like lemon and linseed beside the life he was trying to glue together with joints invisible and strong. The moth on the crate watched him with its geometric eye. And somewhere down the lane, a Mercedes idled engine low, a woman at the wheel, gripping it hard enough to whiten knuckles, trying to find the courage to tell the truth before the truth found him without her. The envelope sat on the workbench for 2 days before Daniel dared touch it again. It seemed to breathe in the dark, whispering questions he wasn't ready to ask. He worked around it, carving and sanding, finishing orders, pretending it wasn't there. But every time he passed, his eyes snagged on those faint watermark letters, Grant and Morrison Holdings. That name had weight. He remembered it vaguely from years ago when he'd still been fighting to keep Sarah alive, when every late-night search for funding led to faceless firms and silent rejections. Now here it was, stamped across the paper that promised him a future. He wanted to believe this was coincidence, but in his gut he knew better. On the third evening, while Ethan was bent over his sketch pad and Sophie leaned beside him offering suggestions, Daniel slipped the envelope into a drawer. Out of sight, but never out of mind. Later, after both children had gone to bed, Daniel stepped outside into the night air. The barn loomed dark against the stars. He lit a cigarette he had promised himself he wouldn't touch again and inhaled as though the smoke could burn away the unease. Across the yard, the cottage windows glowed faint with warmth, reminding him why he'd signed. Ethan. Always Ethan. But another face haunted him too, Isabella's. Her eyes the night she confessed. The folder in her hand. The words that had carved themselves into him. Because of you, I lost everything. The thought twisted deeper. What if she was still behind it all? What if this collective was just another form of her guilt, her way of buying forgiveness? He had no interest in selling. A part of him wanted to tear it all down, to walk away before pride was stripped from him entirely. But another part, the part that had carried Ethan through years of scraping survival, whispered that it didn't matter where the help came from. What mattered was whether it kept his son alive. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and whispered into the dark, God help me if this is another lie. The next morning, Isabella drove to the barn. She didn't announce herself. She never did anymore. Sophie had begged again, and Isabella, against her own instincts, had given in. When they arrived, Ethan met Sophie at the gate with a wooden puzzle box he had been perfecting. Their laughter spilled into the yard, clear and unburdened. Daniel was at the bench planing the edge of a maple slab. He didn't look up as Isabella entered. Your daughter has good taste, he said flatly, the plane rasping across wood. She seems to think Ethan's puzzles are treasures. They are, Isabella said softly. So is your work. He set the plane down, finally turning to her. His eyes burned with suspicion. Funny, that's not what you told me when I asked you for help 5 years ago. She flinched but didn't step back. I know, and I regret it every day. He let out a short, bitter laugh. Regret doesn't feed a kid. Regret doesn't pay for gravestones. Isabella's throat tightened. She wanted to say the truth, that she was already paying for both in ways he didn't know, but the words stuck. If he discovered she was behind Barkridge, everything would collapse. He would see it as charity, not partnership, and his pride would not survive it. Instead, she said, I came to see Sophie happy. That's all. Daniel studied her a long moment, then turned back to the slab, pushing the plane with deliberate force. Then keep it that way. Don't meddle in mine. His tone stung more than she wanted to admit, but she stayed watching the curls of wood fall, listening to the rhythm of his hands. She thought of Sarah's photograph she had glimpsed once on the cottage wall, and guilt pressed sharper. Sophie and Ethan darted in just then, Sophie holding up the puzzle box triumphantly. I found the secret, she cried. Ethan grinned shyly. She's the first one. Their joy cut through the tension like sunlight in a storm. Daniel's shoulders eased, Isabella's heart softened. For a brief moment, the air felt lighter. Later that night, after Isabella had gone, Daniel sat again at the table. The envelope was back in his hand. He traced the watermark with his thumb. Grant and Morrison. Isabella's maiden name. Her empire. He stared at it for a long time, the anger rising like bile, the gratitude fighting to hold it down. Finally, he whispered to the photograph of Sarah on the wall. If it's her, do I walk away? Or do I take what she's giving and make it ours? The photo, as always, gave no answer. Across town, Isabella lay awake too, staring at the ceiling of her mansion. Sophie's laughter still echoed in her ears, but so did Daniel's bitter voice. She whispered into the silence, I'm trying to fix what I broke, even if he never forgives me. The night held both their confessions, neither knowing how close they stood to the truth. The barn had taken on a different kind of silence. Not the easy quiet of wood and tools resting for the night, but a taut stillness that wrapped around Daniel like a noose. He sat at the workbench, the Barkridge envelope spread open before him, its watermark burning into his eyes, Grant and Morrison Holdings. Every curl of sawdust on the floor seemed to whisper the same thing, her name. Isabella. He rubbed his temples, trying to push the thought away. But it returned sharp as a chisel tip. This wasn't coincidence. This was her. She had bought his future the way she bought stocks, properties, entire companies. Only this time the commodity was him. Ethan shuffled into the barn, still in his pajamas, clutching the wooden horse he'd carved. Dad. His voice was sleepy soft. Why are you out here? Daniel forced a smile. Couldn't sleep. He closed the folder, quickly hiding it under a stack of lumber scraps. Ethan set the horse on the table. Sophie said her mom is always working when she can't sleep. She says sometimes her mom talks to papers like they're people. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of Isabella's voice in the barn, low and almost pleading. I'm trying. He hated that part of him believed her. Go on back to bed, buddy, he murmured, brushing sawdust from his son's hair. Big day tomorrow. I'll tuck you in. But long after Ethan drifted off, Daniel sat in the barn, staring at the shadow of the envelope like it was a ghost. The next morning, Adrian Wu arrived. His suit was immaculate as always, his smile measured. He inspected the latest piece, a dining table of oak, each joint seamless, the surface polished to a soft glow. Exceptional as always, Wu said, his fingers gliding reverently across the grain. This one already has a buyer, a collector in Boston. Daniel crossed his arms. Funny thing, I noticed the checks, the watermark. Wu's composure flickered, but only for an instant. And Grant and Morrison. Daniel said, his voice low. You gonna tell me that's coincidence? Wu paused, then set his briefcase on the bench. He met Daniel's gaze steadily. Does it matter? You have a workshop. Your son has a safe home. Your debts are being cleared. Isn't that what you wanted? Daniel's jaw clenched. I didn't want charity. I wanted a chance. There's a difference. Wu sighed softly, closing the briefcase. Then take it as a chance. The rest is noise. But Daniel wasn't convinced. He watched Wu drive away, gravel spitting under the sedan's tires, and the anger inside him coiled tighter. That evening, Isabella came. She didn't drive up to the barn this time. She parked farther down the lane and walked her heels crunching softly on the gravel. Sophie hurried ahead on her crutches, Ethan running to meet her. Their laughter met in the middle, easy and untroubled. Daniel stayed at the bench, sanding a drawer front with slow, deliberate strokes. He didn't look up when Isabella entered. You've been busy, she said quietly, her eyes tracing the finished pieces lined against the wall. Work doesn't stop, Daniel muttered. Isabella stepped closer, her voice softer. Neither does guilt. He froze, the sandpaper stilling in his hand. He turned, finally meeting her eyes. So it is you. Her breath caught, but she didn't deny it. Daniel, you couldn't just leave it alone, could you? His voice was low but sharp. You couldn't let me stand or fall on my own. You had to buy me, again. Isabella's eyes shone, but she held his gaze. I didn't buy you. I gave you what I should have given you 5 years ago, a chance. Daniel's laugh was bitter. You think this erases what happened? You think a shiny workshop in a cottage brings Sarah back? Pay the nights. Ethan wheezed himself to sleep while I counted pennies. Her voice cracked. No, nothing erases that. But I couldn't keep watching. Not after seeing you carry my daughter out of that storm. Not after Sophie clung to you like she'd known you forever. You saved her, Daniel. I wanted to save you." The words hung between them, raw and trembling. Daniel turned away, gripping the edge of the bench until his knuckles blanched. "You don't get to save me. Not you." Silence filled the barn. Only the children's laughter drifted in through the open doors, soft and unbroken. Finally, Isabella stepped back. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then at least let me save the work. Don't punish the craft because of me." She left before he could answer her footsteps fading into the dusk. Daniel stood in the barn long after staring at the half-finished desk. His hand traced the grain absently, but his mind was a storm. He had everything he thought he wanted, but now he had to decide whether pride would let him keep it. The barn felt colder after she left. Not from the night air Daniel had lit the stove and the embers glowed steady, but from something heavier, a silence that pressed down even as the wood crackled. He ran his palm across the unfinished writing desk, feeling the resistance of the grain, the way it bit back against the sandpaper. Every curl of shavings on the floor felt like a reminder: her money, her hand, her name. Ethan padded into the barn sleepy-eyed, dragging his blanket. He climbed into his father's lap without a word, nestling close. Daniel held him, chin resting on his son's dark hair. The boy's breath rattled faintly but steadied as he drifted toward sleep. In that moment, Daniel thought of Sarah again. How she used to say their son was the thread that would keep him tethered to hope, no matter how deep the storm pulled him. What if she's right here in this, he wondered. What if this is the rope I've been given, even if I don't like the hand that threw it? But pride argued louder. Pride said it wasn't rescue, it was purchase. Pride said Isabella's guilt was another shackle. By morning, his conflict hadn't eased. He dropped Ethan at school and drove the old truck into town, parking a block away from the bank. The workshop's first major payment sat folded in his jacket pocket, heavy as stone. He walked through the glass doors and handed the envelope to the teller with calloused fingers. "Big check," the young man behind the counter said with a smile that carried a hint of surprise. Daniel nodded once. "Yeah, big enough to keep promises." When he stepped outside again, the autumn wind cut across the street sharp with the smell of leaves and exhaust. He stood there for a moment staring at nothing until the sound of laughter pulled his head around. Sophie and Ethan side by side walking from school toward Isabella's waiting car. Daniel's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to be there. She leaned against the sleek black Mercedes, her hair loose today, her suit exchanged for a simple wool coat. She looked softer, more human. Ethan spotted his father and waved. Dad Daniel crossed to them slowly. "Thought you were heading home with Mrs. Peterson," he said to his son. "She had an appointment." Ethan replied quickly. "Sophie's mom said she could drive me." Isabella's gaze held his, cautious but steady. "I didn't want him walking alone in this wind. It's too cold." Daniel's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Pride prickled, yet gratitude tried to temper it. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, tugged Sophie's sleeve and began describing a new puzzle box he was designing. The children's chatter filled the space, leaving the adults suspended in silence. "May I show you something?" Isabella asked quietly. Daniel hesitated, then nodded stiffly. She opened the Mercedes door and retrieved a slim binder. She held it out to him, her hands not trembling, but not quite steady either. "These are orders. Real clients, designers, collectors, hotels, people who believe in your work. It's not about me anymore. It's about them." Daniel flipped the binder open, scanning the pages. Each order form bore Barkridge's logo, each request described in detail. Walnut credenzas, custom tables, limited edition chairs. At the bottom of one page, the name of a designer he recognized from magazines. His pulse quickened, equal parts hope and suspicion, and all of this just fell out of the sky. Isabella's lips curved faintly, sadness hidden in the smile. "No, it came from your hands. I only made sure people saw them." Daniel shut the binder with more force than he meant to. "That's the problem. You're in all of this, whether your name's on the page or not." Her eyes glistened, but her voice held. "Would you rather I had stayed away, watched from a distance while you drowned?" He wanted to answer yes. He wanted to cling to the fire of anger. It was safer than letting the ice inside him thaw. But Ethan laughed just then, a clear, unguarded sound. and Daniel felt his resolve splinter. He looked at his son, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, as he and Sophie examined the puzzle box. They were happy, safe alive in a world where wooden toys and shared laughter still mattered. Daniel turned back to Isabella, voice rough. "Don't think this makes us even. Don't think it erases what came before." "I don't," she said simply. He studied her face, the steel and the sorrow, the woman who had once dismissed him like a failed number on a page. And he saw something he hadn't before, not just guilt, but weariness. A woman tired of walls she had built herself. "Then why keep coming back?" he asked quietly. She glanced at Sophie, then back at him. "Because my daughter already chose. She sees the worth in what you build. And maybe I want to see it too this time without blinders." The wind rustled through the maples, scattering golden leaves across the sidewalk. Daniel didn't reply. He only handed the binder back, his eyes, shadowed, his jaw set. But that night, as he lay awake listening to Ethan's steady breathing, his mind replayed her words. "She sees the worth in what you build." For the first time, he wondered if forgiveness and survival could stand in the same room, if the dream Sarah had once shared with him could be reborn in ways he hadn't imagined. And yet, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the image of that watermark still haunted him, proof that some debts never really disappeared, they only changed shape. The barn had become the rhythm of Daniel's days. Morning light filtered through the high windows, catching the dance of sawdust motes. The hum of the planer, the rasp of sandpaper, the smell of linseed oil, all of it stitched into a kind of hymn. He worked with a vigor he hadn't felt in years, each piece a quiet act of defiance against despair. Yet beneath the steady cadence, a knot pulled tighter in his chest, the knowledge that Isabella's hand was hidden in all of it. He could not unsee the watermark. Grant and Morrison Holdings, her empire shadowing his revival. Ethan, meanwhile, thrived. His breathing had steadied in the clear country air, his cheeks grew rounder, his laughter louder. Each evening he and Sophie sprawled on the workshop floor drawing designs, Ethan sketching impossible puzzle mechanisms, Sophie coloring fanciful horses with wings and crowns. Their friendship was untroubled by pride or history. They simply belonged. One night, as Daniel was brushing varnish onto a cherry cabinet, Ethan leaned over his sketchbook. "Dad, do you think we could sell these puzzles too? Not just furniture." Daniel glanced at the crude but clever drawing, the secret compartment drawn with arrows and notes in his son's uneven handwriting. "We could," he said slowly. "People like surprises." Ethan grinned. "Then maybe we could make enough money to buy a dog." Sophie said dogs don't care if you live in a cottage or a castle. Daniel's heart tightened at the simple wisdom. He thought of Sarah, how she'd always said Ethan would grow up seeing more clearly than most. He ruffled his son's hair. "We'll see, buddy." But as night deepened, Daniel's doubts returned. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to Ethan's soft breathing. The workshop was real. The orders were real. The money, too. But if all of it was rooted in Isabella's guilt, wasn't it just another form of dependency? The next morning, Adrian Wu returned with a shipment contract. Daniel signed it reluctantly, his hand heavy. As Wu prepared to leave, Daniel asked flatly, "Tell me the truth. Is she behind this?" Wu's face didn't change, but his pause was too long. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," Daniel snapped. Wu adjusted his tie, his composure slipping for the first time. "Yes, she's involved. She insisted you not know, but I suppose the truth was inevitable." Daniel's jaw tightened. Rage and humiliation surged through him. "So this—" He gestured at the barn, the tools, the polished furniture. "All of it is hers." "No," Wu said firmly. "It's yours. Every piece in here is yours. She only opened a door you should never have had closed. Don't punish the work because of pride." But Daniel wasn't listening anymore. His pride roared louder than reason. That evening, Isabella arrived with Sophie. She lingered at the barn door, cautious as the children darted past her. Ethan showed Sophie his newest puzzle box, their laughter ringing through the rafters. Daniel stood at the bench, arms crossed, eyes cold. "So it's true." Isabella's smile faltered. "Daniel—" "Don't," he cut her off, voice sharp. "Don't pretend this was just business. Don't act like you didn't pull the strings." Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. I never wanted to hide it forever. I only thought, if you knew too soon, you'd refuse the help, and I couldn't watch you sink when I could lift you." His laugh was bitter. "You don't get to decide that for me." Her eyes glistened, but she stepped closer. "I wasn't trying to erase the past. I was trying to atone for it. I ruined your chance once. I couldn't bear to do it twice." Daniel's chest heaved with anger, but under it lay something heavier: exhaustion. He turned away, slamming a drawer shut. "Take your daughter and go." Sophie, sensing the tension, clung tighter to Ethan. "But I don't want to leave," she whispered. Daniel's voice cracked, but he didn't turn back. "Go, Isabella." The barn fell into a suffocating silence after they left, the children's laughter gone, replaced by the sound of the unfinished desk creaking in the stillness. Daniel braced his hands on the bench, head bowed. He felt both victorious and broken, as though cutting ties had severed something in him too. Across town, Isabella sat in her car outside her mansion, tears blurring the lights of the driveway. She whispered to herself, "I gave him back his dream. If he hates me for it, I'll carry that too." But even as she said it, her chest ached with something she hadn't expected, longing not just for redemption, but for a place in the life she had helped shatter. Back at the cottage, Ethan crawled into his bunk, quietly clutching the unfinished puzzle box. His small voice broke the silence. "Dad, are we still going to get to keep the shop?" Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders heavy. He smoothed his son's hair and forced a steady voice. "We'll keep it, buddy, no matter what." But inside, he wasn't sure. The work was his, yes, but the ground it stood on, that belonged to her, and pride, like a storm cloud, refused to leave his sky. The night after Isabella left the barn, Daniel couldn't sleep. The unfinished desk loomed in the corner, its bare top like an accusation. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the shadows on the wall, replaying her words until they frayed into silence. The cottage was quiet, except for the faint wheeze of Ethan's breathing from the other room. At first it was normal, the small, shallow rhythm Daniel had grown used to, but then the breaths caught sharp and erratic, a sound too familiar, too dangerous. Ethan Daniel rushed into the room. The boy sat upright in bed, clutching his chest, eyes wide with panic. His inhaler lay on the nightstand empty. "No," Daniel whispered, heart pounding. He grabbed the inhaler, shook it, pressed it to his son's lips. Nothing. The canister was dry. Ethan's breaths came in desperate gasps, his small body trembling. Panic surged through Daniel. He scooped his son into his arms, his voice shaking. "Hold on, buddy. Just hold on." He stumbled out the door into the night, fumbling for his truck keys. The world narrowed to the sound of Ethan's wheezing. The truck roared to life, headlights cutting across the gravel. Daniel drove faster than he should, his knuckles white on the wheel. "Stay with me, Ethan," he pleaded. "Stay with me." Halfway down the dark lane, a pair of headlights flashed from the opposite direction. The black Mercedes. Isabella's car. She braked hard, her tires crunching against the gravel. The door flew open. "Daniel, what happened?" "Tss. Ethan, he can't breathe." Daniel's voice cracked. Without hesitation, Isabella ran to the passenger side. "Get in my car. It's faster." There was no time to argue. Daniel lifted Ethan into her back seat, climbed in beside him. Isabella gunned the engine, the Mercedes leaping forward like a wild thing. The road blurred. "Hospital?" she asked sharply. "Yes, Millbrook General." Daniel held Ethan against his chest, whispering, "You're okay, buddy. You're okay." Isabella's hands gripped the wheel, steady but urgent. "Keep him upright. Try to calm him. We'll be there in 5 minutes." Daniel had never prayed so hard. Each breath Ethan managed was a knife through his chest. He thought of Sarah, of the night she had sat by Ethan's crib, whispering lullabies through her own tears. He thought of the promises he had made at her grave, that he'd keep their boy safe. And now he was failing. They screeched into the ER entrance. Nurses rushed out as Isabella leaned on the horn. "Asthma attack. No medication," she shouted, her voice cutting through the night like a command. The medical team swept Ethan from Daniel's arms. Oxygen mask monitors, quick orders barked in confident voices. Daniel stumbled after them, but a nurse held him back gently. "Give us 5 minutes, sir." 5 minutes. An eternity. He pressed his palms to his face, shaking. Isabella stood beside him, her hand hovering, then finally resting on his arm. He wanted to shake it off. Instead, he let it stay. When the doctor finally returned, her face was calm. He's stable now. We've given him a nebulizer treatment and steroids. He'll need monitoring tonight, but he's out of danger. Daniel sagged against the wall, tears stinging his eyes. Relief left him weak. He whispered, "Thank God." Isabella's shoulders eased too, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Inside the room, Ethan lay pale but breathing easier, the mask hissing gently. Daniel sat beside him, clutching his hand. "You scared me, kiddo. I'm okay now," Ethan whispered, his voice muffled. He squeezed his father's hand. "Because you didn't let go." Daniel bent and kissed his forehead. His chest ached with love, fear, and guilt. Isabella stood in the doorway, watching quietly. When Daniel finally looked up, their eyes locked. Something unspoken passed between them, raw, unshielded. Later, when Ethan drifted into a medicated sleep, Isabella sat with Daniel in the waiting room. The harsh lights made them both look older, worn. She spoke first. "This is why I couldn't stay away," she said softly. "Because you shouldn't have to fight this alone." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And yet I have. For years." "I know," she admitted. "And I let you. That was my mistake. But tonight, Daniel, I can't watch you carry it all anymore. I want to help. Not as a benefactor, not in secret. As a partner." He looked at her sharply. "Partner. In the work. In the business. In life, if you'll let me." Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I don't want to buy you. I want to stand beside you. With Sophie. With Ethan." Daniel's heart pounded. Pride screamed no, but gratitude, raw and undeniable, whispered yes. He thought of Ethan in the back seat, gasping for air, and Isabella's hands gripping the wheel steady, carrying them both through the night. He leaned back, closing his eyes. "I don't know if I can trust you." She nodded slowly. "Then let me earn it, every day if I have to." The silence stretched heavy, but no longer suffocating. Finally, Daniel opened his eyes. He didn't give her an answer, not yet. But for the first time, he didn't send her away either. And in the sterile hospital light, it felt like the beginning of something new. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. But to Daniel, it felt like sanctuary. Ethan lay asleep in the bed, cheeks flushed, but his breathing steady now. The hiss of the nebulizer had ceased, leaving only the soft beeping of monitors. Daniel sat in the chair beside him, his large hand wrapped gently around his son's. The storm inside his chest had eased, but the exhaustion ran deep into marrow and memory. He had almost lost Ethan. Again. The door opened softly and Isabella stepped in. She carried 2 cups of coffee, one she set quietly on the tray in front of him. "It's terrible," she said with a faint smile. "But it's hot." Daniel nodded, murmured thanks, and took a sip. The bitterness bit his tongue, but the warmth steadied him. For a long while they sat in silence, watching the boys sleep. Finally, Isabella spoke. "When Sophie's father left, I thought I'd never stop being angry. At him, at myself, at the world. I buried it under work, under money, under control. But it always came back at night." Her voice lowered. "And then seeing you with Ethan, I realized you carried the same anger. Only yours came from being left with nothing." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. "You don't have to forgive me," she said softly. "But don't shut me out of helping. Not when I want to carry some of that weight. Not when I owe it to you." Daniel looked at her eyes, shadowed. "You keep saying help. Do you even know what that means outside of money? Outside of fixing things with a check?" Her eyes filled, but her voice held steady. "Maybe I don't. But I want to learn." "Let me." Before he could answer, Ethan stirred. His eyes fluttered open, heavy with sleep, but searching. Dad Daniel leaned forward instantly. "I'm here, buddy." Ethan's small hand reached past him, finding Isabella's. She froze, startled, as his fingers wrapped around hers. "Thanks for driving fast," he whispered before drifting back into slumber. Daniel and Isabella shared a look over the boys' bed. It was brief, raw, but it said more than words could. By morning, Ethan was discharged with new prescriptions and strict instructions. Daniel carried him to the Mercedes, setting him gently in the back seat. Isabella drove them home in silence, the air heavy but not hostile. At the cottage, Ethan insisted on showing Sophie his hospital bracelet, like it was a trophy. The children's laughter filled the small rooms again, chasing away shadows. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, leaning against the rail. Isabella joined him, her coat pulled tight against the autumn chill. The sun was just rising, painting the fields gold. He spoke without looking at her. "I can't promise I'll forgive you. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I can't deny what you did last night." He exhaled the breath heavy. "You saved my boy." Her voice was quiet but firm. "And I'd do it again. Anytime." For the first time, Daniel let the tension ease. Just a little. That week, orders poured in faster than he could finish them. The barn buzzed with life, new commissions, crates arriving for shipment, the smell of fresh varnish lingering like incense. Yet every time Daniel signed a check or glanced at an invoice, the watermark reminded him Isabella was in it, woven through the grain of his second chance. He didn't confront her again. Not yet. But neither did he push her away when she came by with Sophie. One evening, as the children worked side by side, Isabella lingered near the unfinished desk in the corner. She traced a finger along its edge. "You haven't finished this one." Daniel glanced at it. "Some pieces take longer. They tell you when they're ready." She looked at him, her voice soft. "Maybe it's waiting for forgiveness." His eyes met hers, a storm behind them. "Or maybe it's waiting for the truth." The words hung heavy in the air. Isabella lowered her hand, but she didn't leave. For the first time, Daniel didn't ask her to. The night stretched long, filled with sawdust and unspoken things, and though nothing was resolved, something fragile had begun like the faint line of a sketch before the blade makes the first cut. The barn glowed warm in the early evening, its rafters humming with the faint echoes of sanders and laughter. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, her crutches leaning against the wall while Ethan proudly demonstrated the hidden latch in his newest puzzle box. Their giggles rang clear bright against the low hush of the countryside settling into dusk. Daniel watched from his workbench, hand steady on a chisel, though his chest was anything but steady. The unfinished writing desk still waited in the corner, its surface raw and silent. He hadn't touched it since the night he discovered the watermark. Each time his eyes fell on it, something inside him twisted tighter. Isabella stood a few feet away, coat draped over one arm, her gaze moving between the children and the stubborn desk. She didn't speak. She had learned silence was sometimes the only way to stand in his world. Finally, Daniel set down the chisel. "We can't keep circling this," he said, his voice low but firm. "I know it's you. Behind the collective, behind the money, behind all of this." The children froze at the change in his tone. Sophie's eyes darted nervously between her mother and Daniel. Ethan reached for her hand instinctively, as though to shield her from a storm he knew too well. Isabella stepped forward, her face pale but composed. "Yes," she said. "No excuses. No evasion. It's me. I built the scaffolding. Adrian carried the weight where I couldn't. But every joint, every dovetail, every curve, it's yours, Daniel. Always yours." He shook his head, bitterness flashing. "You think that makes it clean? You think that makes me free? All I see is your hand on my life again, buying back what you destroyed." Her voice trembled now, but she didn't retreat. "I didn't buy it. I tried to return it. 5 years ago, I shut a door you should have walked through. I can't undo that, but I can open another. You can hate me if you want. I'll carry it, but don't tell me your work belongs to me. I only lit a lamp in a room you already built." Silence filled the barn. Only the soft creak of the rafters marked time. Ethan's voice broke it small, but certain. "Dad." She drove fast. "If she hadn't, He stopped, eyes-wide words catching. "She saved me too." Sophie squeezed his hand, nodding fiercely. Daniel's chest ached. He turned, staring at the desk in the corner. It seemed to wait for him, accusing and forgiving all at once. He walked to it slowly, laid his palm on its unfinished surface. The wood was cool, patient. "When Sarah was alive," he said softly, not looking at Isabella, "she used to tell me every piece of wood holds a second chance. You just have to see past the knots. Maybe people are the same." Isabella's breath hitched. "Then let me be the knot. Difficult, ugly. Maybe even the reason the piece is stronger when it's done. For a long moment, Daniel stood with his hand on the desk. Pride fought against gratitude, grief against the possibility of healing. Finally, he turned back. His eyes were still wary, but the edge of rage had dulled. "I can't forgive you today," he said, "but I can't pretend you didn't save us. So maybe tomorrow, we'll see." The words were not absolution, but they were not rejection either. And for Isabella, they were enough. The children, sensing the shift, burst into fresh laughter as Ethan unveiled another hidden compartment. The sound filled the barn like a benediction. Daniel moved to the desk, picked up his chisel, and began carving the first clean line into its waiting surface. The wood sang beneath his hand. Isabella watched, silent tears slipping down her cheeks, but this time they carried something new. Not guilt, not loss. Hope. Outside, the night settled over Millbrook. The storm clouds that had once haunted them both were gone, leaving a sky clear and sharp with stars. And in the barn, under lamplight and laughter, a broken dream began to take shape again, stronger, truer, alive. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.